Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where your curiosity leads the way. You send us sources, we pull out the key knowledge you need fast.
Yeah, think of it as getting you up to speed quickly, maybe on your commute.
Exactly. Today, we're tackling, well, the pretty complex world of energy finance.
We are. We've got National Grid's full year results, the period ending March 31st, 2025. The document itself is called FY25 Results Statement v Final.
It's quite dense, this one.
It is, but our job here is to boil it down, get to the core insights for you.
Right, so what we're going to unpack is a clear view of how this big energy player performed financially, what major projects they've got going on, and their outlook for the future.
And you sent this report in. You were clearly interested in how a company like National Grid actually works behind the scenes.
So let's get into it together.
And to help us make sense of all this, especially the financial side, we've got our expert insights ready. The mission is pretty simple, really.
Yeah.
Understand the main takeaways from this report, but crucially, without getting bogged down in every single detail.
We want to pinpoint what really matters if you want a good, solid understanding of where National Grid stands now and where they're headed.
Precisely.
Okay, let's start with the big picture stuff. Performance highlights. First thing that really jumps out is a massive capital investment. Record level, almost $10 billion.
Yeah, and that's up 20% from the previous year. It's a huge figure.
It is.
And what's interesting is how the chief executive links this directly. He's saying this huge spend isn't just upkeep, it's about fundamentally reshaping the grid, both UK and US, for renewables and future demand.
Okay.
He specifically says it's driving regulated asset growth of about 10%.
Right, regulated asset value, the RAV, that's the base they earn returns on.
Exactly. So 10% growth there, that's a pretty strong signal for future earnings potential.
That makes sense? Connecting the investment to the potential returns, and it looks like it's paying off already. Underlying operating profit is up too.
It is, yeah, up 12%, hitting $5,357 million. And importantly, that's at constant currency.
Which strips out the exchange rate wobbles, shows the core business performance.
Right. And profit before tax also had a good jump, up 20% to $4,071 million, again on that underlying basis.
These are strong numbers. That 12% operating profit increase suggests they're running things pretty well day to day.
It does, yeah. Points to improved efficiency, good core performance.
Okay, digging just a bit deeper. Underlying earnings per share, EPS, up 2% to 73.3 pence. They note that's slightly ahead of their guidance.
Just sneaking ahead of their own forecast. That suggests, maybe good cost control, or perhaps things went a bit better than expected across the different parts of the business. Investors definitely watch that EPS figure closely.
And dividends. They're recommending a final dividend of 30.88 pence. That brings the total for the year to 46.72 pence.
Which is a 3.2% increase compared to what they're calling the rebased dividend.
Okay, rebase. That sounds like there's a story there. Why rebase?
Yes. The rebased bit comes from the rights issue they did. So they offered existing shareholders the chance to buy new shares, which means there are more shares out there now. To compare apples to apples year on year for the dividend, they've essentially recalculated last year's dividend as if those new shares already existed then.
Got it. So the underlying growth is still 3.2% despite more shares.
Exactly. It shows they're managing to grow the payout even with the larger share base, which is a positive sign. And their policy is actually to increase it in line with UK CPIH inflation.
The inflation measure, including housing costs.
Right, so this 3.2% increase suggests they're pretty much on track with that policy.
Okay, good context. Let's switch focus a bit. Big projects, strategic initiatives. Sounds like these ASTI projects are a really big deal.
Oh, definitely. ASTI Accelerated Strategic Transmission Investment. These are absolutely crucial for beefing up the UK's main electricity grid, the transmission network, so it can handle all the new wind and solar power coming online.
And they're making progress.
It seems so. All 6 of their initial Wave 1 projects are actually under construction now. That includes the big offshore parts for Eastern Green Links 1 and 2. Those are like massive underwater power cables.
The electricity superhighways.
Pretty much, yeah. So getting those built is significant progress.
And it's not just planning, is it? They're actually connecting new renewables. 2.2 gigawatts in the UK mentioned.
Yeah, and that includes a big slice, 1.2 gigawatts, from the Dogger Bank wind farm.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
It really is. Dogger Bank is enormous, one of the world's biggest offshore wind projects. Connecting that much from it is a major step in, greening the UK's electricity supply.
And it's not just a UK story either, is it? They've got a big transmission project in upstate New York called Smart Path Connect.
Right, yeah. That one's apparently on track to be energized, basically switched on by the end of 2025.
Shows their US footprint is pretty significant too.
Absolutely. Smart Path Connect is all about boosting network capacity in that part of New York. So yeah, they're investing heavily on both sides of the Atlantic to upgrade the grid.
And still in the US, but on the gas side, they're keeping up with replacing old pipes, the leak-prone ones. 352 miles replaced last year.
Yeah, that sounds like essential work.
It does, doesn't it? For safety, obviously, but also efficiency.
Mm.
Stopping methane leaks is important too.
Crucial. Methane's a potent greenhouse gas, so replacing that aging infrastructure helps on the environmental front, as well as safety and reliability. Regulators watch that closely.
And it seems they've been busy sorting out the supply side for all this investment. They mentioned securing supply chains for things like HVDC.
High voltage direct current, yeah, needed for those long distance power links.
Right, and something called the Great Grid Partnership. They say over 2/3 of their whole $60 billion now investment plan now has the supply chains and delivery sorted.
That's actually really important and maybe a bit underappreciated. Nailing down the supply chains early, getting the cables, the transformers, all that gear lined up, it massively reduces the risk of projects getting delayed or costing more than expected.
Especially now, with global supply chains sometimes being tricky.
Exactly. It shows they're thinking ahead, managing the risks strategically.
And finally for this bit, they seem to have been tidying up their portfolio. Completed selling off National Gas Transmission and ESO.
The electricity system operator, yeah. The folks who manage the grid day to day in Great Britain.
Right. And they've agreed to sell National Grid Renewables, too. That feels like quite a shift.
It does signal a strategic refocus, doesn't it? They seem to be doubling down on their core regulated networks, the pipes and wires in the UK and the US.
Moving away from managing the whole system or owning generation assets.
It looks that way. Selling the ESO and National Grid Renewables lets them concentrate their money and effort on those network upgrades, which offer perhaps more predictable long-term returns, especially as they're so central to the energy transition.
Okay, let's talk regulation. Sounds like some positive news on rate cases over in the U.S. That's about setting customer prices, right?
Essentially, yes. Getting new rate deals agreed for their businesses in New York, Kenway, Ketelai, and Nemo, and also in Massachusetts, Menico, that gives them much more certainty about their revenues for the next few years.
And they say about 70% of their planned U.S. investment for the next 5 years is now agreed with regulators.
That's a really key point. It takes a lot of risk off the table for their U.S. financial outlook.
They also got the green light for an Electric Sector Modernization Plan, ESMP, in Massachusetts. What's that all about?
The ESMP basically provides regulatory backing for investments needed to make the grid smarter, more resilient, and ready for more clean energy. Think grid upgrades, integrating things like rooftop solar or batteries. Having that plan approved gives National Grid the confidence to invest in Massachusetts for the long haul.
And back home in the UK, they've submitted a huge plan for REIOT3, $35 billion.
It's a massive number. RIOT3 is the next 5-year regulatory period for electricity transmission here. That $35 billion plan outlines how they want to seriously upgrade the high-voltage network.
Aiming to nearly double power transfer capacity?
That's the goal. And connect loads of new generation, like offshore wind, plus meet rising demand from things like electric vehicles and heat pumps. This plan is pretty fundamental if the UK is going to hit its net zero targets.
Okay, fundamental stuff. What about just keeping the system running? Operational performance, reliability? Seems like they do pretty well there.
Generally, yes. Keeping the lights on and gas flowing is job number one. The reliability figures they quote are very high, above 99.84% for electricity networks generally, and even higher for the main UK transmission grid.
That's impressive.
It is. And 86% availability for their interconnectors, those links to other countries, that's also pretty solid considering how complex they are.
They do mention storms having an impact, though, like Storm Dara in the UK. It's good they highlight the restoration efforts. And I mentioned this FLISR technology in New England.
Ah, yes. FLISR, fault location, isolation, and service restoration. Maybe not. But it's clever stuff. It's basically a smart grid system. It can automatically pinpoint a fault, isolate just that section so it doesn't spread, and then reroute power to get as many people back on as quickly as possible. Really useful during bad weather.
Smart tech. They also mentioned an update on that North Hyde substation outage. Interim review done. Final report coming.
Yeah, being transparent about incidents like that is really important. You need to understand what went wrong and show you're fixing it to maintain public trust and, crucially, prevent it happening again.
On a slightly down note, their injury rate, the LTIFR, went up.
Lost time injury frequency rate, yeah.
They mentioned putting in an enhanced safety reporting system. Safety's got to be paramount.
Absolutely. Any increase in LTIR4 is a serious concern in this industry. You have to tackle it head on. Implementing a better reporting system sounds like a step towards understanding the causes better and hopefully preventing future injuries.
Okay, let's look at the different business segments. UK electricity transmission, they hit an 8.3% return on equity, ROE. Said it was driven by better capital program performance.
And that ties back to the huge 57% jump in capital investment in that segment, largely for those ASTI projects.
Right.
Achieving ROE above what they're allowed suggests they're managing those big projects efficiently, performing well within the rules. ROE is basically profit relative to shareholder equity.
Got it. Then UK electricity distribution, that's the local network. Their operating profit rose 4%, mainly due to RFE indexation, so
Yeah.
inflation on their asset value.
But their achieved ROE was impacted by Storm Dara and something called the RPE mechanism.
RPE, what's that?
Real price effect. It's a regulatory adjustment that tries to account for differences between forecast inflation and the actual inflation the company faces on certain costs.
So if their actual costs went up more than expected inflation.
Exactly. It can put downward pressure on their achieved return, even if other factors like the ROE are positive. Sounds like that's what happened here.
Tricky balancing act. Okay, over to the U.S., New England. Operating profit up thanks to new rates and something called capital tracker revenue.
Yeah, capital trackers let them recover costs for specific pre-approved investments more quickly outside the main rate-setting process, probably linked to things like that pipe replacement program.
And they're expanding FLISR there, too.
Right, boosting resilience.
New York had a really big jump in operating profit, 43% up, mainly due to new rates again.
Yeah, that really shows the impact of getting those new rate cases approved for KDNY and Kevalee. And they also highlighted good progress on their Upstate Upgrade program, another big transmission project there.
Seems the U.S. regulated businesses are doing well. What about National Grid Ventures? That one saw lower profit.
It did. Ventures operates in areas that are less regulated, more market-driven. So things like interconnector revenues can fluctuate more depending on energy trading between the UK and Europe.
Looks like lower revenues there were the main reason for the dip.
Yeah, though partially offset by Viking Link, which is a newer interconnector just starting to contribute. They're also progressing with selling off their Grain LNG terminal.
Liquefied natural gas.
Right. And expanding a gas pipeline capacity, CIP 25. So a lot of moving parts in that segment.
Okay. Quick recap on the strategic stuff we mentioned, the divestments, the National Grid renewable sale. But also, that £7 billion rights issue was completed. That's a huge fundraising.
Absolutely massive. Successfully raising £7 billion really strengthens their financial position. It gives them the firepower they need to fund all that record capital investment we talked about right at the start, really underpins their whole growth and energy transition strategy.
Okay. And finally, sustainability. Looks a bit mixed.
Yeah.
Greenhouse gas emissions were actually up, scope 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, that's something that definitely stands out, especially given the transition focus. It really highlights how complex and, frankly, how long it takes to decarbonize such a vast infrastructure.
And renewable connections in the UK were down, apparently, though up in the US.
Could be down to timing of projects, grid connection queues, various factors. But on the other hand, their updated climate transition plan got almost unanimous shareholder support, 99%.
That's very high support.
It is. It suggests that, despite the current emissions figures, investors are broadly backing their long-term strategy and targets for decarbonization.
And one last piece of news. Leadership change. Zoe Yuzhnovich is set to become the new CEO later this year, taking over from John Pettigrew.
Yeah, always a significant moment when the CEO changes at a company like this. Her appointment marks a new chapter, and her priorities will obviously shape National Grid's direction going forward.
So, wrapping it all up then, it feels like the big story is massive investment, Definite growth focus, especially in those core regulated networks and the big energy transition projects.
I think that's fair. Financials look pretty robust. Lots happening on the regulatory side, which is key for their future. They're clearly in a huge capital deployment phase, building out the networks needed for a different energy future in both the UK and US.
And the divestments really sharpen that focus on the core network business.
Exactly.
You sent us this report, wanting to get the essence without drowning in the detail. Hopefully this deep dive gave you exactly that, a clear, structured look at the key points, explaining some of the jargon along the way.
Yeah, hopefully useful. And thinking about all this investment, the grid upgrades, connecting more renewables, it does lead to a pretty big question for you to think about.
Go on.
Well, with all these plans, all this money being spent, how is it actually going to impact energy reliability, keeping the power flowing, and maybe just as importantly, the affordability of energy for consumers like you down the line?
That's a great question to mull over. Reliability versus cost in this huge transition. If you do want to dig deeper yourself, maybe look up news on those ASTI projects in the UK or the New York transmission upgrades we mentioned.
Good starting points.
Definitely. Thanks so much for sharing the source material with us. This is exactly what the deep dive is here for, making complex stuff understandable, helping you get informed quickly.